motivation behind it and your view of the likely response to it. So the Israelis have not claimed credit for it, but all indications are that they did this. Why would they do something like this?
Mr. Netanyahu must escalate to survive. And he believes that escalating the war is ultimately Israel's salvation. I don't share that view, but that's his opinion. He probably also sees it as his personal salvation. How do you escalate the war? You goad Iran into attacking you. And this is a direct provocation designed to precipitate a major response from Iran. If Iran cannot be dragged into this war, then it is very unlikely that Mr. Netanyahu will be able to drag us into his war on his side. So, simply put, why would you attack the sovereign territory, which is what a consulate or embassy is, as you know, of Iran? You want Iran to attack you so that you can precipitate a war that will involve the United States against Iran on your side.
If the mullahs do nothing, if they exercise Putin-like restraint, what do you expect Netanyahu to do? Ratchet up the attacks on Iran to do everything he can to goad them?
Yes, I would think so. I mean, there's no alternative for him. He knows that he's got to attack Hezbollah, and that's a foregone conclusion. It's just a question of when. So he's got to drag in Iran into this mess as he sees it. Now, what he's not paying attention to is the coalescing of the rest of the region against him. He's not paying much attention to what's going on up in Turkey, for instance. The Turkish population is enraged at Israel, and the Turkish population just rejected Erdogan at the polls. Now, there were several reasons for that, but one of them was Erdogan's continuous provision of oil and food and other things to the Israelis, despite all of his tough talk. And the Turks really want to go after the Israelis. They want action against them. And the Arabs are looking at the Turks as their leaders because they are the one Sunni Muslim power with real military capability that could defeat Israel, because they know that the neighbors cannot.
If Iran attacks Israel, if Iran engages in a war for Israel, that's not a pinprick tit for tat, but a serious war, wouldn't you expect Russia to come to Iran's side? And wouldn't this effectively, thank you, Prime Minister Netanyahu, commence a regional war, almost World War III?
Oh, I think that's true, and I've been saying that for a long time, and people don't seem to understand or grasp it. You have the failed war that Washington's been waging in Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed, and we continue to provoke Russia at every opportunity. I think they're talking about stealing $300 billion Russian funds and turning this over to the Ukrainians. The fools on the Hill want to do this. This kind of behavior makes it inevitable that if we become involved in a conflict with Iran, that the Russians will come to the aid of Iran. There's no question about it. They've deployed forces down into the Red Sea. Their submarines are already in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and they have forces in the Mediterranean. So it's a foregone conclusion that if Mr. Netanyahu is successful and we are dragged into this, we will end up fighting with the Russians directly.
Talk to me about the rage that you mentioned a few minutes ago, Colonel. Is it of such a magnitude that leaders in the area, Turkey, Iran, Jordan, may feel pressured into doing something lest something happen against their will?
Oh, absolutely. This is already true in Egypt and Jordan. And I would argue Saudi Arabia, the Emirates are all under pressure. The elites in the region are under tremendous pressure. And if they don't act, they all stand an excellent chance of going away. General Sisi has tried, as many others, to be on both sides of the fence. On the one hand, he's tried to speak out against what the Israelis are doing, but he's had to renegotiate his enormous national sovereign debt. He's needed our support for that. He wants to keep the United States on side. How much longer that goes on is hard to tell, because the Russians and the Chinese may well step in and offer to help him, which would then grant him some freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis Israel. Then you have the Jordanians, and the Jordanian king is hanging on, I think, by his fingernails. He's a very competent man. He's a brilliant leader. He has negotiated the troubled waters of the region with great alacrity. I don't think he wants in any way, shape, or form to be at war with Israel, but he has over 1 million, enraged Palestinians who want to attack Israel, and I don't think he's going to have much longer to stave it off. I think he's in a very, very sensitive position.
Everybody comments about how lawless, but also how smart Benjamin Netanyahu is. He's a survivor. How dumb was it for the Israelis to follow for an hour and a half a truck with food workers, and then to use 3 missiles to kill 7 people, including an American in that truck? Talk about enraging the public. That's resonating even over here, Colonel.
Well, this is one of the things that reached the American people, and the American people were disturbed by it. But this is not new. These instances of operators of unmanned aerial systems tracking and then killing people who, frankly, were simply in the open, had nothing to do with the enemy per se, Hamas or anything else, are frequent. These things have happened very frequently, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this is an exercise in casual murder at the whim of the Israelis. And the Israeli leadership, remember, they've made it very clear from the beginning that Gaza is full of enemies. If you're in Gaza, you're probably an enemy. They're not going to stop their soldiers from killing anyone, and they're certainly not going to stop the Air Force or the operators of these unmanned systems from killing anyone.
Here's a cut from an Australian television station lamenting, including a clip from Prime Minister Albanese of Australia, lamenting the murder of one of those 7 food workers.
A direct hit from a targeted drone strike, straight through the charity logo that was meant to ensure those inside were protected from harm. 3 vehicles, 7 aid workers obliterated, among them Australian Tommy Frankham. The military telling local media they believed an armed Hamas terror suspect was with the aid workers at the time. The convoy was hit as it left the charity's warehouse in Deir al-Balah after collecting more than 100 tons of food aid delivered to Gaza by sea. 3 precision strikes over a 2.5-kilometre stretch as they tried to outrun the drone. The IDF...
No way this was a mistake, Colonel, no matter what Netanyahu says. Nobody believes him anyway. Nobody in the West. Well, I shouldn't say nobody in the West. Biden and that crowd believe him. Admiral Kirby believes him. They continue to justify what he does. Who challenges Netanyahu in the West besides people like Dennis Kucinich and you and Scott Ritter and me?
Well, there's nothing more reliable than a man that can be bought with cold, hard cash, right? And people need to understand that that's the case in Washington. Most of your political class is bought and paid for by the Israeli lobby. They're not going to jeopardize their positions, their income, their access under any circumstances. Yeah, the other point I would make here, though, that Americans don't seem to understand, I don't think a lot of people do. He called it a war zone. Well, it is, but it isn't. It is and it isn't. First of all, Hamas does not have an integrated air defense system. Hamas is organized, and they're obviously tenacious fighters, but they're not an army. They have rockets, and they use them, and they fire them when they can, but it's a minimum of fire support. And finally, they don't have any naval forces. So you're dealing with essentially guerrillas that, yes, they do swim inside the population, but normally we don't annihilate the entire population on the grounds that it contains a few guerrillas. That's collective punishment. We don't engage in that kind of thing. The bottom line is that this fog of war argument, it wasn't clear. We didn't know. I don't think that's legitimate in this sense at all. Certainly not in this case. Remember, the Israeli troops opened fire on some of their own people who had actually escaped custody and were trying to reach them. This was very early in this entire war, and they were very trigger happy, and they killed their own people. It was only when they finally got close enough to see who they were, they realized they killed Israelis. So this is a sort of a free fire zone in the worst sense of the word. It reminds me a lot of Vietnam and some of the things that we did there.
Colonel, when Netanyahu says, and he says it repeatedly, that he wants to eliminate Hamas, he said recently he thinks it can be done in a couple of weeks. Isn't Hamas an idea? Isn't it impossible for him to eliminate Hamas?
Well, I made that comment early on that killing an idea is much more difficult than killing people. But what this campaign has done is elevated Hamas to a level of notoriety and celebrity that it would never have otherwise had. And that's one of the reasons that I think Netanyahu, in his anger, along with the Israeli public, has said, well, then they all must pay for this. The only solution is the final solution. Eradicate this population once and for all. Hatred has taken over. Emotion has taken over. There is no rational calculus unless you want to judge plans for the annihilation of Arabs in Gaza, in the West Bank, and potentially southern Lebanon as a rational calculus. I think that's simply where we are. By the way, to get back briefly to the Iranians, I think it's important to understand that over the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've heard nothing out of these so-called Iraqi and Syrian Shiite militias. They've gone quiet. They had been attacking us. I think now, after this strike on the consulate, we're likely to see them stir once again and begin attacking us, as well as the Israelis, if they can do it.
Do you think the Iranian government has restrained them?
Yes, I think the Iranian government pleaded with them to back off. And unlike the Houthis, who are far more independent and autonomous, the Iraqi Shiite militias heeded the call for restraint. I think that restraint will now end, and they'll probably work very, very hard to attack us, and as I said, the Israelis in whatever way they can. I don't think you're going to see a deliberate counterstrike from Iranian soil. Because, again, the Iranians don't want a war. This is the thing that has to be understood. Nobody in the region except the Israelis and the United States are enthusiastic about the war.
If the Iranians give Netanyahu his war, how powerful is the Iranian military and how modern is its arsenal of offensive weaponry?
Well, remember, the Iranian army, the ground force, is very small. And the Republican or Revolutionary Guard Corps is really a special operations and special forces element. They go out and work with the various Shiite groups and organizations. They've helped to train and equip these Shiite militias, but they're not really capable of taking the field against the Israeli Defense Force. And frankly, it's too far away. They don't have the logistical infrastructure to sustain anything. Iran's trump card is this arsenal of rockets and missiles, primarily theater and tactical ballistic missiles, but also cruise missiles. And they can reach virtually any target inside Israel. And if they were to attack, I think they would unleash everything. Because once you begin trading missile strikes, restraint doesn't make any sense. You end up in a position where you either use it or you lose it. And why would the Iranians wait around for the United States Air Force and the U.S. Naval Air to attack them and essentially put their arsenal at risk? If they're compelled to fight, I think they would probably launch massive strikes. Now, the other thing is that they're well prepared. They have dispersed a lot of their capabilities. They have dispersed command and control. Even if we destroy much of the command and control, it will still persist. It's very redundant. And so I think it could turn into a long war. The people, of course, who will suffer most are the Israelis at home and the Iranians inside Iran, because Iran's a desert country. I'm sure they will attack water supplies, water purification plants, water distribution points, energy distribution, this sort of thing. And that will have a catastrophic effect on the Iranian populace. That's something the Iranian leadership doesn't want. And as a result, they've been very careful at this point to restrain their own forces from attacking. But, that could end quickly, depending upon next moves by Israel.
Transitioning to Ukraine, Colonel, do you have any indication from sources about whether there are MI6, CIA, Mossad, Ukrainian intelligence fingerprints on the attack on the Crocus Concert Hall?
Well, I'm hearing a variety of things. I don't have concrete, substantive evidence. I'm hearing people tell me that, yes, we've had a hand in this. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that we provided some training? that we encouraged the Ukrainians to do this. It seems unlikely that the SBU, the Ukrainian secret police, and their own sort of branch of special forces would have undertaken something like this without U.S. UK knowledge or backing. I guess it's possible, but it seems unlikely to me. So in that sense, I think it's real. And again, they attacked within the last 24 hours. They managed to attack with a drone, an oil refinery. These are the actions of a dying organization, a dying state, a dying regime. And I think they're very desperate. And I'm sure that we're providing them with whatever intelligence we can that will make these strikes, will magnify the effects of these strikes, because they desperately want the cash that is being discussed on the Hill right now. And apparently, Speaker Johnson, predictably, given his background, is now saying he's going to support this and steer this through the Congress.
And what will happen to that cash? 2/3 of it will stay right here in the United States, going to the military-industrial complex. A chunk of it will go into Zelensky and his buddies' pockets. Will they ever actually get any equipment that will help them? And help them to do what, Colonel? Just delay the inevitable, which is the demise of their country and their government.
I think what is building right now on the Russian side in terms of offensive military capability, the number of points headed and pointed towards the west from Kherson all the way up to Kharkov, suggests that there will be not much left for the Ukrainians to equip and support. I think the end game is now upon us. And if you look at the ground over there, it needs another week or two to firm up so that it can take the large armored forces that the Russians are going to launch. But at the same time, most of Ukrainian air defense, much of the energy infrastructure, the grid, the plants that produce power, these things have been attacked very effectively. Lots and lots of towns are blacked out. And now we see Ukrainian civilians who figured out the handwriting is on the wall and they're leaving. Kharkov is being abandoned. I would not be surprised to see this happen in other cities. Now, in some cases, people who are Russians will probably temporarily leave until the Russians come back, and then they'll return. But those who are first and foremost Ukrainians, they will leave and they will not be back, because they know that this time the Russians will not leave.
The president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, yesterday signed into law a lowering of the draft age from 27 to 25. So they're going to go to law schools and medical schools and graduate schools and take that cadre of people, train them for 3 weeks, and send them into a meat grinder. I guess, Colonel, there's no realization of the desirability of a negotiated settlement. How can they not understand how desperate they are? Before you answer that, the head of the General Stoltenberg wants to put Secretary General Stoltenberg wants to put together a $100 billion loan to give to Zelensky. What's he going to do with
it? I think that the globalist elites that are ruling the states in Europe, in Western Europe primarily, are unwilling to admit the truth, because they know if they admit the truth, they'll be held accountable at the ballot box, and they will lose. I think they're going to lose anyway. But when the truth comes out, they've had it, because they've also committed suicide economically, as you know, by rejecting cheap Russian energy and turning to us for expensive energy and to other means, believing that the future consists of windmills and solar panels. There's no future for windmills and solar panels. That's a lot of nonsense. Civilization needs a lot of cheap, effective energy. You're only going to get that from coal, oil, gas, and nuclear power. But they're going to persist in this fantasy as long as they can. They have nowhere else to go. The other thing that's interesting to me with the Ukrainians in this last-ditch effort to bring people into the military is that it mirrors something that's happening here in the United States. And you've seen the announcements. The Army, the Air Force, the Navy, they want retirees to return. So I don't know what the age limit is, but I think it's under 50. And how many of these retirees want to give up their retirement to come back on active duty? How are they going to entice them? I don't know. There may be bonuses involved, perhaps promotions, but we're not much better off, and we haven't even been to war. That's the thing Americans need to understand. I mean, the Ukrainians have been slaughtered, so they're on their last legs. We're not. But we're facing a similar manpower problem here in the United States. And of course, the other solution is to give migrants, illegals who've come into the United States, the opportunity to serve in the armed forces. In fact, we've even said that they can buy weapons without background checks. Incomprehensible, since we have 80+ million legal gun owners in the United States, and they've all been through background checks. Why we would sell an illegal gun under any circumstances is incomprehensible to me. But everything seems to be designed not only to destroy Russians and to bankroll, the final solution for the Arabs that live in and around Israel. We're also staring at something similar here at home, directed at us, at the American people.
How likely? You've given us a dark picture of what is likely to happen in the Middle East if the Israelis continue to attack Iran. How likely is the war in Ukraine to expand and become a regional war, whether you want to call it World War III or whatever you want to call it, if the EU does give $100 million, whether it's in cash or in equipment, to Zelensky, and if the United States gets the Joe Biden, Mike Johnson, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell $61 billion package over there and extends that war? Is that likely? And if Macron sends in troops, and if Tusk, the president of, or prime minister, I forget which, of Poland, says the era of peace is over, all these things are happening at once. How do you see this playing out?
Well, remember, Tusk was formerly up in Brussels and is very much an EU creature and a globalist. Now, I don't think Tusk resonates very strongly with the Polish population. I'll be surprised if he lasts much longer. If I looked at the latest polling, and the Poles, first of all, are very, very lukewarm on the idea of sending anything to Ukraine, because they see the corruption, and they've got, 3 or 4 million Ukrainian refugees living inside their country as it is. And they know that the Polish military is in no position to launch offensive operations in Ukraine beyond, say, 50 or 60 kilometers, which isn't very much. I think the truth is as follows. That money cannot buy more bodies. It can't buy more manpower. The European forces are boutique organizations. They're small. They're designed, in the case of the French, for operations in North Africa, the British for operations in places like Belize or potentially Cyprus. These are not war-fighting organizations in the historic sense. And our army is under strength. It's not adequately trained. It's sitting around on old equipment. And the logistical support structure that is so essential to launching offensive operations doesn't really exist. So I think the notion that any of this money is going to change anything is, first of all, false.